My antennae flattened against my skull. The microsecond the lecture hall door swung open. For 3 full heartbeats, my mind refused to comprehend the anomaly. Nothing in the environmental readings had alerted me. The atmospheric pressure inside Lecture Hall 9 held completely steady at its standard baseline. The ambient thermal gradient across the terraced seating showed 0 variance. Professor Cavillon was midway through a complex discourse on molecular bond manipulation, his 4 upper forearms gesturing fluently through a glowing holographic diagram suspended over his podium. 31 students sat in their usual configurations across the tiered benches. Everything was precisely as it had been 2 seconds ago. Except now, standing silently in the doorway, there was a creature that had not been there a moment before. And my antennae, organs engineered over eons to read the faintest kinetic whisper, had not detected its approach. That was the first wrong thing. I am Rilith. My species evolved on Vala Prime, a hyperreactive world where absolute silence meant imminent death. On my homeworld, the only organisms that moved without displacing air currents or emitting thermal vibrations were the apex hunters planning to consume you. Every Valisai is born with complex microcilia and sensory antennae capable of reading air displacement, thermal radiation, solid surface vibrations, and trace chemical signals carried on the air. I can feel a professor walking down a hallway 40 meters away through the soles of my feet. I can feel the hydraulic thumping of the garlic boy sitting beside me, Dorvan, his massive cardiovascular system pumping fluid through a 400-kilogram frame that outweighs mine by a factor of 6. I can feel dust settled by a closing door. Yet, I had not felt this creature open the door. She stood framed in the threshold, absurdly small compared to most species in the room. She was shorter than Dorvan and narrower even than my delicate frame. She slung a heavy fabric container over one shoulder, her body wrapped in muted, layered textiles of dark blue and slate gray. 2 legs, 2 arms, a central torso, and a head set atop a short neck with no protective scales, carapace, or dermal plating. Her skin was a pale, soft tone, utterly devoid of natural armor. Her dark brown hair was bound tightly behind her head in a simple knot. By every metric established in galactic xenobiology, she appeared to be a classic prey species, soft, slow, exposed, and fragile. Then she scanned the room, and I registered the second wrong thing. Her eyes moved before her head did. It was a micro-movement, so instantaneous that anyone not actively monitoring her would have missed it entirely. But my antennae were flared, screaming at my hindbrain that something fundamentally dangerous was present. I watched her optical sensors sweep from left to right across the tiered seating in a fraction of a millisecond, cataloging every exit, every student, and every distance. Only after her eyes completed the sweep did her skull turn to follow. It was a tracking mechanism I had seen only once before, during a second-year simulation on predatory mechanics. Ambush predators track targets by moving their heads. Endurance predators track with their entire bodies. But pursuit predators, relentless, uninterrupted stalkers, track with their eyes first and allow the skull to follow. For a pursuit predator, the head is not a sensory array, it is a stabilized weapon mount. The eyes locate the target, the skull aims what comes next. Professor Cavillon stopped mid-sentence. His expression smoothed into a carefully neutral mask, the precise facial posture instructors adopt when briefed on classified directive updates they do not personally endorse. Class, Cavillon announced, his voice clipped. This is our new exchange student. She will be joining our cohort for the remainder of the term under the Galactic Integration Program. Please extend your hospitality. He referenced her file on his display pad. Her name is Lena Vasic. She is a human. Human. I had heard the term mentioned casually in news feeds, a recent first contact species hailing from an uncharted sector in the mid-spiral arm. Information regarding their biology had been sparse. New species joined the broader galactic community every few decades, usually without fanfare. What was unusual, however, was the way Professor Cavillon's lower pair of arms remained pressed tightly against his thorax as he spoke, the universal Tvelin biological sign of intense physical stress. Lena Vasic offered a small smile. It was a subtle gesture, the corners of her mouth curling upward while keeping her lips sealed, revealing no teeth. Several students in the front row smiled back instinctively before catching themselves. Beside me, Dorvan leaned forward with the casual arrogance of a species that had never been smaller than anything in its natural habitat. But before he could utter a word, he abruptly recoiled. His neck frill, the thick cartilage ring garlic males flare during dominance displays, clamped flat against his windpipe. Lena was directed toward an empty workstation near the middle row. As she walked, I focused my sensory antennae directly on her lower extremities, desperate to track her movement. She wore soft-soled foot coverings, but even accounting for the material, the kinetic vibration she generated across the hard composite floor was virtually non-existent. She moved like still water, displacing almost nothing. Every joint in her body absorbed its own kinetic impact before the vibration could travel into the deck plates. That was not formal martial training. That was not a conscious technique. That was 10,000 generations of evolutionary pressure from a world where making a sound while moving meant something larger, faster, and hungrier heard you first. She reached her desk, set her bag on the floor, folded her hands smoothly over the surface, and directed her gaze forward with an air of polite, attentive silence. I realized I had not drawn a breath in nearly 30 seconds. The initial 2 days of Lena's presence were defined by an eerie, fragile quiet. But during the midweek advanced chemistry laboratory, the illusion of her fragility was brutally shattered. Professor Kavalan distributed the experimental trays, reviewed containment protocols, and assigned us to paired workstations. I was partnered with Tezkal, a Skirth student whose 4 compound eyes rendered him a brilliant lab technician, though his ambush predator temperament made him utterly devoid of social grace. We operated under a quiet agreement, he monitored reactions, and I logged the data. Across the central aisle, Lena Vasic was paired with Dorvan. They worked efficiently at their station, Dorvan handling the heavy structural glassware while Lena measured liquid reagents into smaller volumetric vessels. Over 48 hours, Dorvan had cultivated a cautious friendliness toward her. He laughed at her quiet remarks, asked about her origin system, and listened with wide-eyed disbelief when she described atmospheric frozen water, something she called snow, falling from the sky in massive white sheets. For a brief moment, the laboratory felt entirely normal. Then the glass shattered. It was a standard graduated pipette, a heavy-walled, reinforced borosilicate glass tube designed for precise liquid delivery. Every species at the Academy utilized them daily. They were rated for a Class 6 structural grip strength, far exceeding the physical pressure limits of any student enrolled in an academic track. Lena was holding the pipette, measuring a chemical reagent, when her fingers tightened around the cylinder by a fractional degree. It was a micro-adjustment that would have been completely imperceptible on any other student. The glass did not simply crack. It collapsed inward under her grip, imploding into dozens of jagged fragments. A razor-sharp shard sliced clean across the palm of her left hand. A brief, sharp crunch echoed through the silent room, followed by the soft clatter of falling glass. Lena uttered a single, sharp word in her native tongue, a quiet, low-level expression of annoyance, the tone one uses when misplacing a tool, not when sustaining an open physical laceration. She lifted her palm. A bright, vivid line of crimson fluid immediately began welling from the deep gash, standing out in stark, unnatural contrast against her pale skin. With calm efficiency, she reached for a sterile cloth from the workstation rack, pressed it firmly against the cut, and began wrapping it around her hand. Her expression remained completely unbothered. Then the scent hit the room. My antennae registered the molecular shift before my conscious mind could process the sensory input. A dense, metallic chemical signature bloomed into the air, carried swiftly on the laboratory's warm circulation currents. My olfactory receptors decoded the compound automatically, and the result struck my awareness like an icy shock to the nervous system. Iron. Free-floating, highly concentrated, hemoglobin-bound iron. The fluid leaking from Lena Vasic's hand was red because it was saturated with pure iron, the very element utilized across the galaxy for industrial warship hulls, structural girders, and high-tensile armor plating. Heavy metal was dissolved directly inside her bloodstream, circulating through her body at high pressure, and now dispersing rapidly into the shared atmosphere. The reaction across the room was instantaneous and catastrophic. A Palori girl in the front row, a species possessing hypersensitive chemoceptor tendrils capable of tasting the environment, went completely rigid. Her tendrils locked straight out from her skull in an involuntary neurotoxin alarm posture. Before anyone could reach her, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed sideways off her stool, unconscious before her body hit the floor. 2 desks behind her, a Rilith male gasped as his digestive tract violently rejected its contents. His species' evolutionary biology recognized the heavy metallic signature as an ancient marker of high-tier biohazardous apex predators, triggering an immediate, uncontrollable panic purge. At the edge of the front row, a Tvelan student named Creven froze entirely, his mouth opening as a rapid, high-pitched clicking sound erupted from his throat. It was an ancestral distress call encoded into his species' DNA, a sound that meant only one thing across every Tvelan world: an apex predator is inside the boundary, and it is too late to run. The laboratory erupted into absolute chaos. Students shoved back from their stations, chairs overturned, and panicked shouts filled the air in half a dozen languages. Professor Kavalin yelled for order, his 4 upper arms raised high in a desperate bid for authority. Through the entire panic, Lena Vasic remained standing exactly where she was. She held her wrapped hand pressed against her abdomen, her non-injured hand raised flat, palm outward, fingers spread, a universal posture demonstrating she held no weapons. She took one measured step backward, away from the thrashing students, and stood entirely still, keeping her movements slow and predictable while emergency medical personnel rushed into the room. The medical team stabilized the unconscious Palori, cleared the Rilith, and coaxed Creven out of his instinctual shock loop. The laboratory was evacuated immediately, students streaming into the corridors in dazed, terrified clusters. I stayed behind, lingering at the threshold of the doorway. My antennae continued to pick up trace iron molecules in the air, every biological instinct urging me to flee. But something far stronger, a profound, chilling curiosity, kept me anchored to the spot. Through the doorway, I watched a senior medical technician scan Lena's wounded hand with an advanced diagnostic wand. The technician stared at the digital readout, his face pale with utter disbelief. "The wound is already clotting," the technician whispered to his colleague, his voice trembling slightly. "The vascular breach occurred less than 4 minutes ago. Her body has already deployed specialized cellular fibers to build a biological seal across the damaged tissue without external assistance. Look at her pain response readings." The second technician leaned over the screen. "Her pain receptors are firing at maximum threshold, yet her vital signs show zero neurocognitive shutdown. Her brain is receiving damage reports and simply choosing to override them." The primary technician looked up at Lena, who was politely thanking them for the scan and asking if the students who fainted were going to recover. "I am recommending an immediate biological hazard reclassification for her entire species before the end of the day," the technician muttered under his breath. That night, I retreated to my private quarters and accessed the restricted Academy database. I pulled up the single, partially redacted research file available on Earth. I scrolled past the heavy black classification bars until I found the section on Earth's physical parameters. My eyes locked onto a single statistic, and I read it 4 times to ensure my translator hadn't errored: surface gravity index, 1G standard. The galactic median for worlds capable of producing sapient life was 0.6 G. Earth was nearly double the standard baseline. Every creature, every bone, every drop of fluid on that planet existed under a crushing gravitational load that would fracture the skeletal structures of most galactic species over a standard cycle. Yet humans did not merely survive it. They ran. They jumped. They built cities. And they carried iron in their veins to pump oxygen through muscular tissue forged to defy a Deathworld's crushing gravity. I turned off the terminal, sat in the pitch-black darkness of my room, and pressed my antennae flat against my skull. I didn't sleep a single second that night. 7 days after the incident in the chemistry lab, the Academy administration announced quarterly physical assessment day. Under normal circumstances, physical assessment was a mundane, bureaucratic routine. Every cohort underwent standardized fitness evaluations to benchmark physical health. Students lined up, performed basic physical tasks, received their baseline scores, and returned to their dorms with nothing more than mild muscular fatigue. However, as our cohort filed into the lower-level athletic complex, a massive, high-ceiling chamber equipped with advanced diagnostic machinery, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The testing stations had been reconfigured. I passed the primary grip dynamometer and caught the digital calibration numbers flashing on its master display, maximum threshold, Class 8. Last quarter, the machine had been capped at Class 6. Someone in the administration had forcibly expanded the testing parameters by 2 full classifications. And I didn't need to ask why. Lena arrived alongside the rest of our group, wearing the standard-issue gray athletic tunic provided by the Academy. On her, the attire looked almost absurdly ill-fitting. Her arms possessed no visible muscular bulk, at least not compared to the heavy-gravity species in our class. Her legs were slender, her frame compact. She appeared exactly as she had on day 1, a small, soft-skinned girl who belonged in the lowest performance quartile of any physical test. She moved toward the equipment with visible hesitation, asking the monitoring staff polite, quiet questions about how the diagnostic interfaces functioned. Several students relaxed. Dorvin stood near the first station, his massive, scaled arms folded over his broad chest. He chuckled, his deep voice carrying across the floor. "Don't worry, little human. I'll make sure the instructors don't set the resistance curve too high for you." A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd. Lena offered a brief, polite smile, a quick flash of composure that revealed nothing of her internal thoughts. The assessment commenced. Students rotated through the stations in assigned groups. I completed my trials quickly, recording the average, uninspired scores typical of my species, fast optical reflexes, minimal grip strength, and cardiovascular endurance calibrated for a low-gravity homeworld. My attention, however, remained fixed on the station where Lena stepped up to the grip dynamometer. She placed her bare hand around the sensor grip. The instructor signaled for her to begin. Lena closed her fingers and squeezed. The digital readout surged instantly. It passed Class 2, my species' absolute biological limit. It passed Class 4, the ceiling for most avian and insectoid species. It breached Class 5, where mid-weight galactic species capped out. It reached Class 6, the standard limit for heavy-duty military personnel. It didn't stop. The numbers flickered rapidly and locked in at Class 7. The instructor stared at the digital pad, looked at Lena's small, unarmored hand, and then looked back at the pad. Lena released the handle, flexed her fingers twice to work out a mild cramp, and stepped back with the nonchalant air of someone who had just completed a minor administrative task. Class 7 grip strength. A Class 8 rating was reserved for a fully grown garlic, a 400-kilogram behemoth engineered with dense bone structures and thick muscle fibers. Lena weighed roughly 60 kilograms, yet her grip strength rivaled a creature 6 times her mass. Next was the neural reflex matrix. Students stood on a pressure-sensitive platform while random visual and auditory stimuli fired from unpredictable angles. Response speed was measured in precise milliseconds. When Tizkal, the Skirth ambush predator, took the platform, his performance was staggering. His ambush predator neurology allowed him to react before a light pulse had even fully formed. His initial reaction times were unmatched. However, the test was programmed for 50 consecutive trials. By trial 12, Tiskel's reaction times began to decay. By trial 20, his neural pathways were burning through their chemical reserves. By trial 30, he was visibly exhausted, his explosive system completely drained. The instructors pulled him off the pad, his body shivering from metabolic depletion. Then Lena took the platform. Her reaction times were not as blindingly fast as Tiskel's initial burst. But as the test dragged on, something incredible happened. Her numbers remained completely flat. Trial 10, Trial 20, Trial 40, Trial 50, her reaction times did not fluctuate by a single millisecond. Her neurological system did not burn hot and fast like an ambush predator, it operated with cold, uninterrupted consistency. She could maintain combat-ready reflexes indefinitely because her ancestors had not hunted in short bursts, they had hunted across endless days. The final evaluation was the environmental endurance chamber, a sealed pod designed to measure cardiovascular output and thermal adaptability under extreme atmospheric stress. Lena entered the pod, and the internal temperature began to plummet. At 15 degrees below standard galactic baseline, where most warm-blooded species signaled for emergency release, Lena simply reported that she felt chilly. The instructors lowered the temperature further. Through the pod's reinforced observation window, I watched Lena's body initiate a physical response I had never witnessed in xenobiology textbooks. Her skeletal muscles began contracting and releasing in rapid microcycles, a constant, rhythmic vibration across her entire frame. I looked at the internal pod telemetry. Her core body temperature was not dropping. It was holding entirely steady. Her body was actively burning internal metabolic fuel to generate a localized heating field, fighting the external cold with an internal furnace that dynamically recalibrated its output in real time. When the final composite scores were posted on the master wall display 15 minutes later, an absolute silence descended over the athletic complex. Lena Vasic had not achieved the single highest score in any individual category. She was not the absolute strongest, nor the absolute fastest. But her name appeared in the top 15% across every single metric simultaneously: strength, speed, reflexes, endurance, thermal regulation, and recovery rate. Every other species in the galaxy had sacrificed one capability to master another: speed for strength, reflexes for endurance, armor for agility. Lena Vasic had traded nothing. She was an absolute generalist of such staggering biological balance that she possessed no exploitable physical weakness. Dorvin stared at the display board in total silence. Lena had beaten him in 4 out of 7 physical categories and matched him in a 5th. His jaw hung slightly slack, his neck frill completely limp against his throat. He did not make another joke. In the weeks following the physical assessment, the atmosphere across the campus underwent a subtle, profound shift. Students didn't openly avoid Lena, but they maintained a distinct radius around her in the corridors, a few extra paces of clearance, a slight pause before entering a lift she occupied. I, however, chose a different path. Driven by a mixture of terrifying awe and academic fascination, I invited Lena to partner with me for the upcoming midterm xenobiology examinations. To my surprise, she accepted with genuine enthusiasm. We established a routine, meeting late in the afternoons at a quiet corner table in the Academy's central archive. It was during these study sessions that I discovered something far more unsettling than her physical statistics: the sheer, terrifying depth of her intellect. Lena did not process information passively. She approached knowledge like a tracker following a trail. She connected concepts across wildly disparate fields, linking chemical reaction rates directly to macroecological adaptation with a fluid ease that suggested her mind recognized no boundaries between scientific disciplines. During our 3rd study session, as we reviewed planetary ecosystem structures, the conversation turned to evolutionary hierarchy. On most galactic worlds, I explained, gesturing to a holographic chart, ecosystems form clean, vertical pyramids. Primary producers at the base, herbivores in the middle, and a small, highly specialized apex predator class at the peak. Lena looked at the projection and let out a soft, dry laugh. Earth doesn't have pyramids, Rilith. We have webs. Tangled, chaotic, violent webs. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. On Earth, predators eat other predators. Herbivores evolve lethal armaments to hunt their former hunters. Parasites hijack the nervous systems of hosts to force them into self-destructive behaviors. Fungi consume living tissue from the inside out. Nothing on my world is stable. Nothing is safe. The only constant is that if an organism stops adapting, it ceases to exist within a generation. I stared at her, my antennae curling tight against my neck. And where do humans sit on this web? We're at the top now, she said smoothly. Her voice dropped, taking on a flat, somber tone. But we didn't start there. For millions of years, we were in the middle. We were prey. Giant cats, massive birds of prey, packs of dire wolves, they all hunted us. We survived because we were clever, because we improvised, and because we stood together. She paused, looking down at her folded hands. But we lost countless numbers along the way. Especially the young. The predators always targeted the children. The sentence hung heavy in the air, cold and absolute. It was a single statement, delivered without theatrical emotion, yet it unlocked the entire mystery of human psychology. It explained why her eyes scanned rooms before her head moved, why her body maintained perpetual alertness, and why her species carried an innate, unyielding drive to master every environment they encountered. Their dominance had not been birthed from arrogance, it had been forged in the crushing trauma of an eon spent being hunted. As the days progressed, I documented further anomalies in her daily routine. I learned that Lena could voluntarily slow her metabolic rate to hold her breath for over 2 minutes without brain damage, a fact revealed during a routine atmospheric depressurization drill that left the drill supervisor speechless. I learned that she did not require a continuous 8-hour sleep cycle like most galactic species, instead, she could execute short 20-minute micro-rest cycles, something she called napping, waking up fully alert and operational within seconds. And I witnessed her cry. It occurred during a historical lecture on the tragic extinction of the Penari species. As the instructor displayed historical imagery of the fallen civilization, I noticed clear, liquid drops welling in the corners of Lena's eyes and tracing down her cheeks. Panicked, assuming she was experiencing an acute chemical exposure or internal cranial hemorrhage, I reached for the medical alert tab on my desk. Lena gently caught my wrist. Her grip was soft, entirely controlled, yet as firm as an iron vice. "I'm fine, Rilith," she whispered softly, wiping her cheeks with the back of her sleeve. "It's called crying. Humans emit fluid from their eyes when we experience intense emotion, grief, beauty, loss. It's how our nervous system sheds psychological stress." I stared at her in dazed wonder. She was a creature whose blood contained industrial metals, whose grip could shatter reinforced glass, whose body generated its own thermal regulation fields, and whose species had clawed its way to the top of a Deathworld food web. Yet, she sat in a quiet lecture hall, weeping softly over the loss of an alien civilization she had never known. She was an impossible contradiction, a living weapon wrapped in profound, quiet empathy. And as I sat beside her, I realized with absolute clarity that I was no longer terrified of what she was. I was terrified of what would happen if the galaxy ever forced her to stop being polite. The disaster struck on a heavy, overcast afternoon during third period lecture. It did not begin with the standard, rhythmic pulse of a routine safety drill. It began with a low, continuous, bone-rattling resonance that vibrated directly through the structural deck plates, a frequency specifically engineered to trigger immediate primal threat awareness in every species on campus simultaneously. My antennae flared to maximum extension, locking rigid. Around the room, students bolted upright in their seats. Professor Cavalin froze mid-lecture, his lower arms pressing flat against his thorax as his upper limbs reached for the master console. The Academy's automated emergency intelligence broadcasted across all overhead channels, its voice stripped of emotion, unauthorized biological hazard detected in Eastern Bioresearch Wing. Classification, active predatory fauna, uncontained. Species identification, Corvathi stalker. Single adult specimen. All personnel initiate shelter-in-place protocol immediately. Security response time, estimated 11 minutes. A wave of sheer terror swept through the lecture hall. I knew precisely what a Corvathi stalker was. We had reviewed their profile in advanced xenobiology. They were mid-tier apex ambush hunters originating from a Class 6 Deathworld. Weighing approximately 40 kilograms, they were built low, compact, and blazingly fast, with armored chameleon-like plating that allowed them to slip through narrow structural spaces completely unseen. They hunted exclusively by thermal signature, tracking the body heat of warm-blooded prey through solid walls. Their primary offensive weapon was a tail-mounted array of hollow, venomous spines capable of launching a potent neuroparalytic compound on impact. A single spine contained enough toxin to paralyze a massive garlic for 6 hours. For a smaller species like mine, the venom would collapse the respiratory system in under 2 minutes. Worse, the bioresearch wing was separated from our academic building by a single, 40-meter connecting corridor. There were no heavy blast doors between the two sectors. If the Corvathi stalker had entered the connector, it was already inside our building. Panicked students began scrambling toward the reinforced interior corners of the lecture hall, pulling emergency containment barriers from their wall mounts and huddling together in terrified clusters. Dorvan stepped to the front of the largest group, his massive frame positioned as a physical shield, his heavy fists clenched. But brute force meant nothing against a stealth predator that struck from shadows before you even registered its presence. Security was 11 minutes away. A Corvathi stalker could cross 40 meters in under 3 seconds. Then, Lena Vasic stood up. She did not scramble. She did not panic. She rose from her desk with the calm, fluid grace she used when leaving a lecture. She stepped out into the central aisle, her eyes fixed directly on the sealed exterior door of the lecture hall. Her face had completely changed. The polite, warm expression she wore daily was gone. In its place was something cold, ancient, and absolute. Her eyes were steady, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Her hands hung loose at her sides, relaxed, uncompressed, and ready. She spoke without turning around, her voice remarkably level, cutting through the whimpers of the terrified students. "How heavy is it?" she asked. I was the only one in the room whose vocal apparatus was functional enough to respond. 40 kilograms, I stammered, my antennae quivering violently. Low build. Fast over short distances. Hunts by thermal tracking. Its tail spines carry a lethal paralytic compound. One strike will end you. Lena nodded slowly, absorbing the tactical data without a single flicker of fear. She reached down, picked up her heavy winter jacket, a thick garment crafted from densely woven synthetic fibers, and wrapped it tightly around her left forearm in overlapping layers. She wound it securely from wrist to elbow, creating a thick, padded gauntlet. Next, she walked smoothly to the nearest laboratory workstation, a heavy unit anchored to the deck with solid steel support struts. She reached down, wrapped her bare hands around one of the solid steel support rods, and pulled. A terrible screech of tearing metal echoed through the room as the steel rod bent under her application of force. She adjusted her leverage and pulled a second time. With a loud snap, the thick steel strut sheared completely clean off the heavy frame. She lifted the steel bar, tested its balance in her hand, and adjusted her grip. It was a meter long, solid, and heavy enough to crack armor plating. An improvised, functional war club. She turned and marched directly toward the sealed lecture hall door. "Vasic!" Professor Kavalin shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "The facility is in automatic lockdown. That door is magnetically sealed. You cannot open it, and you must not step into that corridor." Lena reached the door control panel. She didn't press the digital interface. Instead, she slipped her blunt fingernails beneath the edge of the plastic maintenance cover and pried the panel face completely off with a sharp flick of her wrist. She reached into the exposed circuitry, found the manual emergency override lever, and pulled it down. The magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy pneumatic hiss. The heavy door slid open. Red emergency strobe lights flooded into the doorway from the corridor outside, casting everything in a deep, crimson wash. The hallway stretched ahead, dark, narrow, and silent. Lena Vasic stepped through the threshold, stepping into the red light alone, carrying a steel rod in her right hand and a padded jacket wrapped around her left arm. The door slid shut behind her. For 5 agonizing seconds, no one in the lecture hall moved. Then, Dorvan lunged toward the wall-mounted security terminal and activated the corridor's live camera feed. The feed was washed in dark red from the emergency lighting, but the optical resolution was razor-sharp. Lena was moving down the center of the corridor at a steady, measured walking pace. She was not running. She was not cowering. She walked with the deliberate, balanced stride of an apex hunter entering a contested territory. Her head was held high, her eyes executing that continuous, methodical predator sweep, left to right, scanning ceiling pipes, dark alcoves, and structural shadows. She held the heavy steel rod low at her right side, angled forward. Her padded left arm was raised to chest height, presented forward as an improvised shield. She reached the junction connecting to the bio-research wing. Through the camera feed, we saw it. Crouched in the deep shadows against the far wall was the Korvathi stalker. It was terrifying, a low-slung, armored nightmare covered in shifting, dark thermal plates. Its 2 heat-sensing pits were locked directly onto Lena's thermal signature. It had been waiting in ambush. Its tail was raised high, the crown of venomous spines fanned open like a cluster of deadly needles. The Korvathi stalker launched its attack. It exploded forward with terrifying velocity, covering 10 meters in less than a second, its powerful claws ripping against the floor tiles. It moved faster than anything I had ever seen outside of high-speed combat simulations. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. As the beast leapt at her chest, Lena shifted her weight onto her back foot, pivoted her hips, and executed a precise, lightning-fast sidestep. It was not a desperate dodge birthed from panic. It was a calculated evasion vector executed with absolute spatial timing, the nervous system of a species that had spent 100,000 years dodging razor-sharp claws on a Deathworld. Computing trajectories in the space between heartbeats. The Korvathi stalker passed through the empty air where she had stood a millisecond before. Its claws scraped uselessly against the deck. Before the creature could complete its turn, Lena brought the heavy steel strut down with crushing force. She didn't swing wildly. She targeted the exact neurological junction where the creature's armored skull met its primary spinal column. The steel bar struck with a deafening crack. The force of the impact staggered the 40-kilogram predator, breaking its momentum and shattering its armored crest. In a desperate, reflexive death agony, the creature's tail whipped around, driving its venomous spines directly into Lena's presented left arm. The sharp, hollow spines slammed into the heavy synthetic jacket wrapped around her forearm. The thick layers of dense fabric absorbed the blow, the razor-sharp tips penetrating 2 outer layers of synthetic weave, but failing to reach her skin. Before the creature could retract its weapon, Lena's bare right hand shot forward, her iron-gripped fingers clamping brutally around the base of the creature's tail. The Korvathi stalker thrashed violently, 40 kilograms of muscle and armor trying to wrench itself free. But Lena's forearm muscles locked like steel cables. She held the thrashing Deathworld predator entirely immobile with one arm while bringing the steel strut down a second time. And a third. The heavy steel bar struck the neurological center with cold, methodical precision. The Korvathi stalker went completely limp. Its limbs twitched with dying neural impulses, its predatory coordination permanently broken. It collapsed onto the crimson-lit deck tiles, dormant and neutralized. Lena released her grip on the tail, took one step back, and stood over the fallen apex hunter, breathing deeply, her steel bar raised and ready in case it moved. It did not move. Without missing a beat, Lena turned away from the neutralized threat and marched further down the corridor. The security camera tracked her as she reached a figure slumped against the far wall near the research wing entrance, a Tvelan laboratory technician who had been caught in the corridor during the initial breach. He was conscious but bleeding profusely from a massive laceration across his upper chest. Lena dropped to her knees beside him. She dropped the steel rod, pressed her bare hands directly over his wound, and applied firm, steady pressure to arrest the blood loss. Through the feed's ambient audio, we heard her speaking to him in a low, gentle, unwavering voice, offering quiet words of comfort in her native tongue. She kept pressure clamped over his torn artery with one hand while using her other to monitor his respiratory rate, keeping him conscious and oriented in the dark. She remained on her knees in the crimson light, holding the alien technician's life together with her bare hands, for 9 full minutes until heavy security forces finally breached the corridor. When the tactical response team arrived, 6 heavily armored guards carrying high-grade plasma rifles, the team leader skidded to an absolute halt, staring at the scene in stunned disbelief. He looked at the neutralized Korvathi stalker lying on the deck. He looked at the stabilized technician. And then he looked at the human girl, her jacket shredded, her hands covered in Tvelan blood, looking up at them with calm, operational clarity. You took down a Class 6 Deathworld stalker with a piece of furniture, the security officer stammered. Lena wiped a streak of dark dust from her forehead with her sleeve. It was only 40 kilograms, she said simply, as if that explained everything. 10 minutes later, the facility lockdown was formally lifted. The Korvathi stalker was sedated and secured, and the injured technician was rushed to the primary medical bay. Lena was escorted back into Lecture Hall 9. As she crossed the threshold, every single student in the room stood up. No one issued an instruction, sitting down in her presence simply felt fundamentally wrong. I noticed her hands immediately. As she walked down the aisle, a fine, rhythmic tremor was running through her fingers. To an untrained observer, it appeared to be the uncontrollable shaking of extreme terror. But my study of human biology told me the truth. Her body was experiencing a severe post-combat adrenal crash. During the engagement, her nervous system had flooded her bloodstream with adrenaline, a brutal chemical cocktail designed to temporarily amplify strength, speed, optical processing, and pain tolerance to superhuman levels. Now that the threat was neutralized, the chemical compound was metabolizing out of her system, leaving behind an involuntary physiological tremor. It was the biological weapon powering down after deployment. An hour later, I sat in the Central Student Commons and watched the Academy's Public Species Database execute a mandatory system refresh. The Central Information holoscreen flashed bright red, updating the official file for Earth. The planetary status field refreshed from pending review to a new, permanent classification, Class 12 DATHWRLD. I stared at the glowing red letters in utter awe. The Galactic Hazard Scale had previously maxed out at Class 10, a designation reserved for hyperhostile worlds barely capable of sustaining sapient life. The Galactic Integration Board had officially expanded the Universal Rating Scale by 2 full tiers specifically to categorize the hellscape that had forged human biology. Beneath her planetary file, Lena's personal exchange profile updated with a new administrative directive, Integration Risk Assessment, revised. That evening, I found Lena sitting by herself in the far corner of the grand dining hall. The expansive chamber was dimly lit, the overhead light set to evening cycle. She sat quietly over a tray of food, surrounded by dozens of empty tables, a solitary figure isolated by the unspoken fear of an entire campus. I did not pause. I picked up my tray, walked across the polished floor, and pulled out the chair directly across from her. She looked up in genuine surprise. Her expression shifted rapidly through a series of complex emotions, surprise, caution, apprehension, before settling into a look of quiet, hopeful vulnerability. "Hey, Rilith," she said softly. "Hello, Lena," I replied, setting my tray down. We ate in silence for several minutes. It was not an awkward quiet, it was the comfortable silence of two organisms sharing space without pretense. Finally, I set my eating utensil down. The question had been building inside my mind since the day she stepped through the classroom door, a question I had carried through chemistry implosions, physical assessments, and a lethal predator encounter. I looked into her soft brown eyes and spoke quietly, "What are you, Lena?" Lena slowly set her fork down. She looked at me directly, and for the first time since her arrival, the polite social mask dropped away entirely. Behind it was neither a monster nor a helpless girl. It was simply a person, unfiltered, raw, carrying a profound weight. "I am a human, Rilith," she said softly, her voice steady. "I am 16 standard years old. I come from a city called Volgograd on a planet called Earth. I love advanced mathematics, I am terrible at visual art, and I miss my family so much my chest aches every single night." She paused, offering a sad, brief smile. "But I know that isn't what you're asking." "No," I replied gently. "It isn't." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Earth is a world where everything has spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything else. Organisms there don't cooperate with their environment, they wage absolute war against it. Nothing is given on Earth. Everything is taken by force or endurance." She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "And humans. My species didn't win that war by being the strongest, or the fastest, or by carrying natural venom. We were never any of those things." "Then how did you win?" I asked, my antennae leaning forward. Lena looked at me with those intense, forward-facing eyes. "We never stopped," she said flatly. "That is the only secret, Rilith. We never stopped." She gestured with her hand. "When we hunted, we didn't sprint like ambush predators. We picked a target, and we walked after it. We followed it when it ran, we tracked it when it hid, we pursued it through burning deserts, across frozen mountains, and across raging rivers. We followed it until the prey, stronger, faster, and deadlier than us, simply collapsed from absolute exhaustion. Because while everything else on our planet could outrun us in a short burst, nothing on Earth could run forever except us." Her voice dropped, thick with ancient history. "We broke our bones and kept walking. We contracted lethal pathogens, and our blood built biological weapons to destroy them from the inside out. We ate toxic plants until our livers learned to process the poison. We survived 4 billion years of continuous evolutionary pressure. And every single human alive carries all of that pressure locked inside their cells every second of every day." She tapped her sternum lightly with her knuckle. "It's all in here. The hunt chemistry, the structural density, the pain override, the cold calculation under fire. It never turns off. It just waits." The dining hall was dead silent around us. "Then why are you here?" I asked, voicing the ultimate paradox. "Why send a Deathworld predator to an academy filled with species who faint at the smell of your blood?" A sudden, deep pain flickered across Lena's face, a quiet, bone-deep sorrow that shattered my heart. "Because we don't want to be monsters anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "We have been alone on our world for 200,000 years, Rilith. 200,000 years surrounded by nothing but fear and violence. And when we finally broke through our atmosphere and reached out to the stars, the first thing we found was a galaxy full of civilizations who took one look at us and recoiled in terror." A single, clear tear escaped her eye, catching the dim overhead light as it traced down her cheek. "I know what I am," she continued, wiping her face. "I know my body was built for war. When that Korvathi stalker charged me in the corridor, my mind didn't process fear, it calculated its turning radius and targeted its spinal column. I know that isn't normal. But I came here because someone had to be the first one to sit in the classroom, fail the art exam, eat lunch alone, and prove to the galaxy that underneath the armor, we are just people. She looked at me with tears glistening in her eyes. My mother cried when I boarded the transport. She told me that every bridge in history was built by someone willing to stand in the middle of it while both sides decided whether to cross. I am standing in the middle of the bridge, Rilith. And I am so tired, but I am still standing. Silence descended between us, a heavy, beautiful, historic silence. I looked across the table at the girl from the Class 12 Deathworld. I looked at the hands that could bend steel, the blood that carried heavy metals, the mind forged in eons of relentless survival. And then, I reached into my satchel, pulled out my advanced xenobiology textbook, slid it across the table, and opened it to Chapter 9. The final examination is in 2 days, I said quietly. Your understanding of multicardiac redundancy was severely lacking during our last study session, and I refuse to let you drag my academic score down. Lena stared at the textbook. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. Slowly, a real smile broke across her face, not the closed-mouthed, cautious version she presented to the world, but a full, brilliant, radiant smile. It revealed her teeth, the sharp, dangerous teeth of a Deathworld omnivore, and for the first time in my life, my hindbrain didn't scream. My forebrain simply said, friend. Thank you, Rilith, she whispered. You're welcome, I replied. Now, turn to page 200. We have a lot of work to do. And there, beneath the quiet lights of an alien academy, a Deathworld predator and a Valisai scholar studied together late into the night. We were two different worlds, standing together in the middle of the bridge, and neither of us flinched.